Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer here at Orthogonal. Thank you all for joining us today. We don't take it for granted that you take time out of your busy schedules to log in for something like this. So briefly, very briefly about Orthogonal, if you don't know who we are, we got into this business to improve patient outcomes faster. The way we do it is by working with companies building medical device software to help them accelerate the development of software as a medical device, connected device systems, and digital therapeutics. In other words, all of the software that's regulated as part of a medical device, unless it's physically inside a medical device. And the way we help do that acceleration is by taking the best of modern software engineering and product management tools and techniques, not from MedTech, but really, that came out of the tech industry and other industries that have let so many industries move so fast with software, and fusing them with MedTech's focus on safety and effectiveness in a way that goes far beyond saying, we can be lean and agile and user-centered, but don't worry, we're still compliant. The way we really look at it is that by bringing modern software methods to medical device software, we can actually fundamentally raise the bar on safety and effectiveness while building better devices faster than ever before. Two very quick things for you before we get going. We value your brutally candid feedback on this webinar, suggestions for future ones. There's a good chance you'll hear from me or somebody else at our firm. So if you could please reply and just tell us what you think. That's how we get better, and that's how we create more value for you in the future. I didn't used to say this, but I was told that it was actually not obvious. So very quickly, Orthogonal can help you with your software development needs. And I think that the topic's very timely because everybody's very concerned about de-acceleration or acceleration right now, given all the changes going on in the regulatory world. And I'd also be remiss to point out that each of our panelists also offers their own services. And I'll give you a second when you introduce yourselves to talk about that. So feel free to connect with them as well. Okay. This is, I think, the highest registration we've gotten on a webinar ever. I felt like I would email somebody and within 20 minutes, somebody at your organization, if not them, would be registering for it. So we are not a beltway watching firm. We are not experts on the Hill, but it seemed like this is so impactful to people bringing medical device software to market. There was a good chance to kind of take a breath and look around and say, well, what can we do to figure out what is going on? And what should companies be doing short-term, medium-term, long-term in the era of uncertainty? And I'll add to that, uncertainty, brings challenges and potentially risks, but it also can bring opportunities. Certain things can get better. So I think we're going to try and cover all of those today. And our goal is really for you to take away some very actionable gold nuggets, things you can do immediately after the webinar. And we will ask at the closing, actually, each of the panelists to share that. So we're going to try and pack into the next 50 minutes the core discussion and all the content we promised you. We're going to start by giving you some frameworks of how to think about changes at the FDA. So it's not just sort of a big black box of the FDA, but let's talk a little bit about some of the dynamics and mechanisms and how those will be changing. And then we're going to do some case studies. We've got a couple of hypothetical ones prepared. In addition, I have prepared a Google form where you can anonymously submit case questions to us, which seemed like it might be a good one that people might be a little more open about some of their questions if they knew it wasn't coming to us. So put it there. I will get those back in my Google form, and we'll be feeding that to the audience, feeding that to the panelists, sorry. So we'll be done about 12:50. That said, we frequently go a full 90 minutes with Q&A. So as long as you all have questions, we're here to answer them. And we actually find about 40% of the people hang around. Now, one last thing for you, we're pretty excited about. We're kind of treating this like a call-in radio show. And as a result, we thought it'd be really every call-in radio show needs a jingle. So give me a second here, and I'm going to try and play the official jingle. Well, actually, we're only going to play the first part of it. It's actually kind of long. But at the end, if you want to hang out at the end, we'll play the full thing and we will post it as well. All right, so share sound. If you can please let me know if you hear this. Can you hear?
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Gets better.
Got a question. Call us now. We've got Randy, Megan's on the prowl.
So amazing.
Filled with today.
Yeah.
Connected devices, AI too. We'll break it down just for you.
All right. Stop my share here.
That is burned into my memory in the worst way imaginable.
Really nice bar.
With that, Steve, make sure you stick on at the end because there's a whole second verse and actually some of my favorite lyrics.
I
At the very
mean,
end.
I don't even know what to say.
It's just
I'm flummoxed. I'm speechless.
Yeah.
If you don't
Yeah.
think I have a new ringtone on my phone, you're mistaken.
in a good way. In a good way. That's right. Steve, I'll be looking for the gold album behind you, like with that other gold album you got hanging up. Okay. So let's start on other topics with our theme song, and thank you to all of our panelists and our callers today. So frameworks. Let's talk a little bit about how things get done at the FDA, to then look at how changes at the FDA will impact those things and understand kind of process. This is a process crowd on the phone today and on the line, so I think it'll work well. So first of all, FDA's budget comes from two different places, as we talk about. Can you guys explain, or you all explain, what those places are, how they come, who determines that money, what it's intended for?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a cut at that, Randy, and then Phil and Kwame can jump in to explain what I've gotten wrong, which will inevitably happen. Look, I mean, let me start by saying there's been a kerfuffle in the public about the idea of industry capture because some portion of FDA's fees are provided by industry. And I mean, in a menu full of nothing burgers, this is a big nothing burger, which is to say, across government and certainly across FDA, industry regularly pays fees to government in exchange for services. And the same is true at FDA, right? And so industry comes together and says, we're going to give you X amount of dollars over the next, I mean, it's negotiated on a 5-year basis. So over the next 5 years or so, in exchange, you, the agency, are going to commit to do a number of things that are typically associated with improving efficiency. I think that what is most important is just categorically, there's no commitment by FDA to we're just going to approve your products, right? I mean, what the FDA is agreeing to is to say we're going to give you some predictability about the timeframes that we'll use to make our decision, but there's just no guarantee ever that the decision is going to be favorable to industry simply because some portion of payment for personnel was covered by industry. The other piece of the pie comes from traditional congressional funding. I'm not going to go super down that particular path, which is to say, Congress allocates funding to FDA, like every agency, every year to cover operations. And Kwame, Phil, others may have a different view, but there is no world in which FDA can operate functionally, given the volume of work that it has to do, relying exclusively on congressional appropriations. There's just not enough money. So let me stop there and let my knowledgeable peers jump in.
Yeah, I think Steve's painted a good overview of sort of the framework there. And I think a little bit more context here. Don't hold me to the math on this, but my understanding is approximately a third of, let's focus on sort of FDA or CDRH's budget, comes from user fees. The other sort of 66% comes from appropriated dollars. And in both those instances, the agency really controls, right, how that money is going to be spent. In the user fee funded side, what happens, as Steve correctly identified, upfront, industry and FDA align on what are the priority areas of focus. What are the areas that industry and FDA both agree that if additional resources were provided here would have a mutual benefit both to industry, to public health, to FDA. And oftentimes that comes in the form of aligning on timeframes, aligning on external programs and projects that should also be funded there. So that's generally how I think about it in those percentages.
I also forgot to ask you each to introduce yourselves, so maybe let's take a second and do that. Phil?
Sure. So Phil Desjardins, I'm a partner at Orton and Porter. So legal and regulatory sort of counsel to many companies, traditionally in the medical device, digital health, sort of AI space. Spent about 10 years at US FDA in a variety of sort of policy-facing roles, worked in the industry for some large MedTech companies, and currently help to support many sort of MedTech digital health companies navigate FDA.
Welcome. Steve?
Hi, nice to see everybody, or at least talk to you all. Steve Silverman. I am president of the Silverman Group. We are a consultancy that serves regulatory product manufacturers. So it includes devices and predominantly concerns devices, but it also captures other medical products like drugs and biologics. And I work with them on policy and regulatory strategy issues. I think for purposes of your audience, the thing that is more relevant is that, like Phil, and like Kwame, I was at FDA for quite a while. I was there for almost 15 years, and I ran the Office of Compliance in the Device Center for my last 5 years at the agency. And then since leaving the agency, I've stayed pretty heavily involved in the MedTech space.
Excellent. Kwame, we'll go to you, and then I'll pose the next question to you.
Absolutely. I'm Kwame Elmer. I serve as the managing partner of MedTech Impact Partners. We help medical device, diagnostic, and digital health companies navigate the FDA. We work at the intersection of value creation and regulatory milestones with a heavy input of research. And what's relevant, I just thought about this. Phil kind of grew up in the policy side. Steve ran the post-market compliance wing, and I grew up in the pre-market area. So I'm the Robin to their Batman in terms of my FDA career.
Or vice versa.
Very good. And you're now in a country western band that composed the theme song.
Cowboy Carter who? Yeah.
Okay, so Kwame, we'll go to you, and then we'll move back to Megan for an introduction and a last question. So broadly speaking, I think I think of it that there's two ways that the government sets policy. One is by making rules and decisions and publishing things, and regulations and guidance. The other one is simply by directing resources towards or away certain things. It's sort of a policy by promotion or benign neglect, right? Could you elaborate a little bit on that and how we should think about what's going on at the FDA in terms of what's going to be an explicit policy change and what will be based on where resources are and aren't put, or I guess perhaps scuttlebutt on the ground about how things should be happening, unofficial?
There are a few key stakeholders that tie into the mission of the FDA. And at the core, one main and probably primary and singular stakeholder is the patient. And the FDA often takes a risk-based approach to working on activities and programs that more directly impact the patient. So we saw this with COVID and the streamlining of review of EUAs because of the intense and immediate public health impact. There is actually another stakeholder, which is rare, but I'll just bring them up in occasions and in instances where there is immediate need from the Department of Defense. The FDA can prioritize that activity. But in the day-to-day work of the FDA, typically applications and activities that directly impact the patient will be prioritized first. And in our world, that may be something like review of an IDE, permission to conduct a significant risk study on patients. Or it may be evaluation of a breakthrough technology that can treat a larger patient population than ever before. Less important activities that may be deprioritized in this era would be having a meeting for pre-submission to talk about bench data needed for a 510K. And the FDA actively has processes to calibrate and prioritize based on those factors. Did I cover it, Randy? There's a pregnant pause. Did I get it all?
I was waiting to see if anybody else is going to jump in.
All right.
If not, I'll direct one more framework question to Megan. Megan, if you could please introduce yourself first.
Sure. Hi, I am Megan Graham. I am VP of Quality and Regulatory at Orthogonal. I've been in the medical device industry over 25 years, working on any kind of system that has a lot of software in it or is software all by itself. For the past 10 years, I've been in the consulting space, primarily on startups and digital health area. And my primary focus is taking all of this information and building either a QMS strategy for an organization, building it from the ground up, or I'm adding software. I've never done software before. Now I want to add software to my capabilities, or I want to just know how we can do things better. For our medical devices or adjacent to medical devices. Maybe you're not a medical device now, but you think you will be at some point in time. And on the product side, building out the quality regulatory strategy for the product. How do I get it on the market? How do I build kind of on that quality framework for software development practices so that I can really iterate, get new value to the customers and the patients that need them in a very efficient and quick as possible way while navigating all of these requirements, whether it's in the US or any other place in the world.
Excellent. Okay, so the question I'll throw to you, and then we'll ask anybody else to add on, is sort of there are different functions in terms of medical device. There are different functions that the FDA serves, and each one of them has a potential to impact patients through medical device manufacturers. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the different functions of the FDA and what that means for us as manufacturers?
Sure. I'll talk about it from the product strategy perspective and how do I take this information and build the framework? The FDA is a really good source for not just the regulations, but they provide quite a bit of information in form of guidance and other information, whether it's training, industry training, industry subject matter expertise types of points of contact on how to go about doing that. They provide guidance documents that interpret best practices that might be in medical device industry or in another industry. For example, best practices for AI/ML, and translate that into a framework that's kind of like a standard, but it's not quite a standard, that says, here's how you can think about these regulations. And here are some best practices of how to comply effectively to these regulations, because the regulations are very, very generic in a sense, in that they're not super specific about how you go about doing that. So the FDA has been a huge source for that information, and that's really to support innovation, the innovation side of their mission.
Yeah, I agree with everything Megan said there. And the question reminded me of go back in the time machine, I think about 15 years ago, and remember vividly Steve, and I think Kwame was in the room as well, sitting down with Jeff Shern and thinking through and developing a mission statement for CDRH. What is the mission of FDA? And at that point, you had a new center director coming in and saying, this is going to be our North Star, directing us like, what do we do and what do we focus on a daily basis? I remember breaking that mission statement into criteria. And to me, there's 4 buckets. At the beginning and the top of that list is protecting and promoting public health. And protecting and promoting, I think, are 2 sides of the same coin. And there's the 4 different buckets I break it into are exactly what Kwame identified early on. The first is pre-market submissions, reviewing new products that are coming to the public to make sure 2 things. Number 1, that they're safe and effective. They are not going to harm people, at least not without the right appropriate benefit risk analysis. They're going to do what they say they're going to do, and that they're being clear on that. And that they're sort of well understood and actually reaching patients. I think one thing that often gets overlooked when we think about FDA, it's not just making sure that those products are safe and effective, but it's also enabling those new products to get to patients. And I always look at it sort of, what's the risk associated with product X? And I say, well, we're really good at quantifying what those risks are. They've been studied, we know it. Let's also make sure we don't overlook, how do we quantify? How do we think about what's the risk of this patient not being available to, or this product not being available to patients? Because that's something that needs to go into that process as well. So to me, it's that pre-market setting, letting new products get out there. It's the post-market setting. Hey, we thought we knew everything we could at this point, but how is this product performing in the wild. It's a compliance or auditing setting. Hey, we've established expectations of what does it mean? What are the table stakes for being a manufacturer of medical products? And through the audit process, through inspections, through reviewing quality systems, are companies living up to what those regulatory obligations are to play in this regulated environment? And then finally, one that I think often gets overlooked is FDA really is the gold standard globally. They set the tone, they set the policies, they set the expectation for global product safety and efficacy. And I've had many conversations with international companies and even international regulators. They often look to FDA. If we can get on the market in the US, we've sort of proven we've jumped over the highest bar possible. And global regulators are also looking, all right, how is FDA thinking about new and innovative topics like AI, digital health, some of these other spaces? So to me, that's sort of is all encompassing of what FDA does on a daily basis and how they view and how I view their overall mission.
I think that's a really great point, and I want to say, like in the startup space, I've seen quite a few times when investment, investor readiness, and for companies is directly tied to being able to get on the market in the US, and that has not changed. That has been strengthened in the past decade, I would say. And so that's been a huge part of most strategies that I've seen.
Okay, so we'll get into the case studies. Actually, one last framework I'll throw out myself that I'm a little fond of, which is if you think of the FDA as a corporation, presumably the chairperson of the board is the CEO of America, or the president, but the board members are Congress. And there's two things that board members will yell at the CEO about for the company. One is, I have a constituent who died because you let a medical device onto the market that killed him because it wasn't ready, it wasn't safe. What are you guys doing letting this snake oil on the market? The other one is, I have a constituent with this revolutionary new device that's going to change the world, and you keep holding them up. What's the problem? Why can't they get to market, right? And so you're kind of balancing both of those as in terms of ultimately the people representing the constituents. Okay, so with all of that in the lens of if we're building devices with software's medical device, AI, ML, digital products, what do we do today, given all the changes going on? And here's our first hypothetical case study. It's an early stage startup that's developing a novel device for neurological diagnostics. We're not sure if we're going to get de novo and or breakthrough classification. We're planning some pre-sub meetings at the FDA. One goal of being getting pointed in a direction towards a 510K instead of a de novo. My questions are, will the FDA be available for pre-sub meetings? If I submit the request for a pre-sub tomorrow, what's the best case, likely case, and worst case in terms of when I might get that meeting? Has that timing changed? And do you think that all the changes going on at the FDA right now could impact if I get a breakthrough designation or not? And what happens if I do get one?
I think that the best information that we can provide in response to the scenario that you are describing, Randy, is to say this. There are major changes underway at FDA that are having impact across the agency. That's a kind of obvious statement. Everybody in the world knows that, right? And so what are the implications for customers of FDA? And I would look at it in terms of two levels. First, on the one hand, nothing that has happened so far has suggested that day-to-day life at FDA for stakeholders like companies who are submitting to the agency is going to radically change, right? The agency hasn't walked back, for example, from its commitment to hold QSub meetings, to review most submissions within a preset predictable period of time, et cetera, et cetera. And so while the disruptions that have been affecting the agency have been occurring, certainly there hasn't been any official FDA statement or reports indicating that FDA's ordinary approach to doing business, product review, for example, is going to change. By the same token, it's naive to think that those types of basic practices aren't subject to change. As one example, before this call began, a number of us were talking about the fact that there are many people at FDA in response to some of the hardships they have been facing recently, like 5 day a week return to work to facilities that are not set up to house them, that are considering leaving the agency. Many of those individuals will, and it is likely that the significant departures of FDA staff is going to make it difficult to meet commitments that were historically negotiated. For example, for things like timelines for review of and decisions about product submissions. No specific information at this point, but I would say watchful waiting is table stakes.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it, Steve. Right now, I'll just reiterate what you said. We haven't seen the impact, or I've not seen the impact immediately yet, but we're still within the first sort of 2 months of trying to feel out exactly what the impact's going to look like. I can tell you there was that period about a month ago where all probationary staff at FDA were let go and then brought back a week later. Immediately, all my emails from FDA started not bouncing back, but were going into the ether. I was not getting responses. Fast forward 2 weeks, that staff came back in there. And we started seeing the wheels of motion were going again. That was my back of the envelope math on that was a reduction of approximately 10% of CDRH's staff. We talked earlier about sort of the budget dynamics of appropriated versus user fee supported dollars. We are going to get into not just the user fee discussions, but every year Congress has to approve a budget for FDA, and they're starting that process for 2026 right now. I've heard, and I'm playing in the speculation rumor game right now, but amongst sort of DC, some of the early starting point for that conversation for FDA was approximately a reduction of about 30%. Just want to be clear, that's not been approved. That's the starting point. That could go to 40, that could go to 10, that could go to 0. Who knows what the reductions might look like? But if we felt an immediate impact at a 10% reduction, if we go to 30, I absolutely anticipate we're going to feel that on the flip side. Hopefully, FDA can continue to meet its MDUFA commitments in terms of timelines for things like 510Ks, PMAs, their statutory commitments for IDE reviews, those things. That would be great. But the first thing we're probably going to lose is the back and forth and the Q subs, the pre-sub meetings there. Whether they disappear entirely, whether they establish a new threshold bar of here's the types of substantive questions we're going to be able to spend time on, or they just take, instead of taking 70 days to schedule right now, they take a year to schedule. We don't know what that impact will be, but I think that will be the first place I would anticipate feeling the crunch.
Anybody else?
More midterm, there's been a ceasing or a pause on FDA staffers engaging in guidance development and activity on standards working groups. And that is important. That's important work to be very transparent about the regulatory and scientific bar that companies need to meet. And we've also seen some taking away of certain guidances and then putting them back in place. So I would try and use the Wayback Machine literally and look at guidances that were active on a website. And as a conservative OEM, think and assume that I need to meet those standards and those guidances that have been promulgated in the past, because we've seen some flip-flop there. And there's been a diminution of activities and guidance development and standards development. So I would just also track those.
Yeah, I mean, just to double click on Kwame's point, it is a separate topic, but the importance of administrative guidelines, guardrails that have been put in place to restrict further guidance promulgation can't be overstated, right? It is huge. It is going to have a tremendous effect on FDA's ability to communicate with stakeholders going forward. And so, in my view, the ability for the agency to talk publicly across broad regulatory issues the way that it has historically is shrinking to the size of a pinhole.
I agree, and this is where strategies are built, right? So if you're a company in this space, if you've been doing this for a long time, you might be the experts in the standards development. So this might not impact you quite as much. But if you're not involved in those conversations, those industry conversations, or you're not actively involved in professional societies or advocacy groups for industry, such as AdvaMed, you might not have firsthand knowledge of what the latest and greatest. A standard takes years to come on board and be released. So this is where I anticipate there's maybe not this year, but if this trend continues, if there's a continuation with the FDA not being as involved in things outside the FDA in industry, I do think this is going to be a significant challenge in the US. I think there's an opportunity globally or with non-FDA to engage in standards development, guidance, those kinds of things, developing good practices. But the FDA guidance and participation is really where uh, the conversations are happening to align industry with FDA on interpretation, on what's reasonable. What does it mean to be risk-based? What does good look like? So that is an area that if this continues, that I would anticipate there being a significant impact.
Megan,
Randy, I'm
Good.
sorry, I'm just a moment. I'm thinking about your original question, right? Which is your hypothetical involves a startup that's trying to get its new technology to market. And some of these issues are large and critical and probably not absolutely germane to startups, which are basically trying to figure out, how do I stay alive? How do I get to market, and how do I sell my product? And the question is, what's the world going to look like 6 months from now when I'm ready to hit the go button on my submission compared to today? And in answering that question, I stand by what I said earlier, which is we don't have a lot of information right now that suggests a huge shift in how CDRH does business, but you're naive if you're not paying attention.
Yeah, Megan touched on one thing. I think this question arose in the context of sort of pre-subs and formal interactions with the agency, which is one way, and a very helpful way, of getting very product-specific feedback to a specific company. Another tool that I think CDRH and FDA in general that I found helpful, is the idea of these descriptive, informative guidance documents that help elaborate on FDA's perspective on how to comply with a particular regulation or topic. I'm thinking about things in the areas of AI, other areas sort of in digital health. Again, oftentimes these documents leave things to be desired. Oftentimes we don't necessarily agree with FDA's interpretation, but I'd much rather understand what their interpretation is and be able to respond to it than try to guess or have a one-off conversation where it could change from a reviewer to reviewer. One of my additional concerns is whether it be from a funding perspective or some other additional oversights amount on the amount of regulations or guidance documents can be published. If we lose the ability for FDA to publish these beneficial, not documents that create new regulatory burden, but documents that explain how to meet existing regulatory requirements, that's another way we could lose out on the ability to understand what needs to be done to bring these products to market.
And I would add, the opportunity for industry to weigh in on those guidance. They would publish the draft, and then industry would have an opportunity to consume the information, think about the information, comment on that publicly, or the public would have an opportunity to do that. So that's another opportunity to, not just the final draft, but the draft guidance itself is a really good area to have those conversations and understand what the FDA is thinking.
Okay, I want to take a moment to remind our attendees, if you look in the chat window, there's a link to a Google form where you can anonymously submit us questions if it's something you'd rather not have your name on here. But we will continue to take questions. All right, the second one, I think we're going to tune this a little bit based on some of the answers, but I'm with an established medical device firm that's been in market in the US for about 10 years. Our device does some really whiz-bang remote monitoring of the heart for adults with a risk of heart disease. In our next version, we're planning to add a lot more AI/ML to the device to amp up the value we can provide to doctors and patients. I'm hearing rumors of attrition among the staff we've been working with on this device over the years. I used to be able to assume the staff had a good background on my company and device, but I fear that the institutional knowledge and relationship we built up may now be gone. Any suggestions?
So I just have an immediate thought. When Phil and Steve and I started out at the agency, we actually developed software. Oh, Randy, software to robustly track application. This issue of institutional knowledge, while it is real, there are still many of our colleagues who at this point have 20 plus years of experience who I suspect will weather this storm, if I can say that. That's one. Two, getting back to the software, it houses the decisions that were made, the thought processes that help the reviewers get to that decision. So there are some great aspects of the agency in place to prevent institutional knowledge. I fully understand that companies very much dislike getting a new lead reviewer, and that can lead to some items that are lost in translation. I recognize and I'm sensitive to that, but I do want to highlight what I think people maybe not understand, that the FDA isn't just an organization using paper and pencils. They have some robust systems in place to guard against loss of institutional knowledge.
Yeah, I think that there are two steps or two strategies that firms should take in the circumstances that you're describing, Randy. And the first is simply communicate, right? So the concern that companies have about departure of staff and impact on things like submission review is legitimate. So check the concern. Send out, if you do not hear from your lead reviewer in an appropriate period of time about a particular issue, light a flare. Send a quick email saying, hey, just checking in to make sure everything is okay. You have the information that you need. Are you getting a response? I mean, if after that kind of outreach, there's radio silence, then I think it's appropriate under those circumstances to move the communication up a level in the chain to include both your primary contact and that individual's supervisor. You're not tattling. You're just saying like, hey, just following up on this earlier message, any information you can provide, right? And then that gives that individual's supervisor an opportunity to say like, hey, actually that person is not with the agency. And if that's the case, it's exactly what Kwame described a moment ago. The second strategy I think companies need to be prepared to adopt is simply the onus is on them to educate CDRH staff about novel technological facets of their devices. If there is a loss of high-level expertise such that people who would ordinarily understand how this technology works don't, right? Well, then the responsibility is on the companies, is on the sponsors to go back to CDRH and say, hey, let us talk to you about what this device is doing and how we think that that affects the regulatory framework. And that may involve going back and rebuilding knowledge bases that were established previously and that deteriorated somewhat associated with staff departures. Yes, it's inefficient for all the reasons that Kwame indicated. And also that is the circumstance in which we are operating in.
I would just elaborate on one point I think both Kwame identified and Steve picked up on. At the end of the day, I mean, Kwame focused on the systems that are in place, but there's still people on the other end of these emails and these pieces. And one best practice that I recommend with all my clients, and I try to do it, whenever I'm starting a new interaction, whether it be a new 510K, a new submission, a new post-market issue, open up a line of dialogue. Once you identified who that lead reviewer is going to be on your file, a 3-line email saying, hey, I don't think we've had the opportunity to work before, provide a little bit of history of, hey, I've been working with John and Sally and Joe on this particular issue. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to jump on a call and bring you up to speed with our most recent sort of conversations. You're not forcing anything down their throat. You're not forcing a conversation that might not be necessary. But what I like to do is open the door. You might have a 600-page file sitting in front of you. If you want to know where a specific piece of information is, reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to point you in that direction to save you time and ultimately save ourselves time. That early email, just to establish an open line of communication. Here's my email address. I'm happy to chat with you. I'm happy to respond to anything. In my experience, has saved hours, if not weeks, on review, because somebody can reach out informally to say, I'm looking for this. I'm having trouble locating it. Can you point me in the right direction? And those are the things that, whether it's a brand new reviewer to FDA or just a brand new reviewer to a file or a seasoned reviewer in both, that can save time in the long run.
Absolutely. I hear from some clients in the past, there's especially startup clients, a little bit of a mystique about the FDA. And really, companies should understand that getting this product to market, the FDA has a job to do, right? And it's up to us as on the manufacturer side to help them do that effectively, right? Nobody wants a product that's non-compliant or unsafe or ineffective on the market. That's not good for the company. That's not good for the industry. That's not good for that particular market. Like even, so if one type of product has a problem, all companies with that type of product are going to see some kind of effect from that there's going to be a problem. So any kind of approaching it like a collaborative effort, I think, and reaching out, I think that's a great idea for companies to really put their best foot forward. I will say too, though, that I've seen a really nice increase in the past 10 years in particular, as the FDA has sought out more and more experts in these novel technologies. It's really made that job a lot easier. So it's really nice to be able to talk to someone at the FDA who might know more than you do, right? Who might actually have quite a bit of expertise in a general topic. Maybe you know your product really well, but maybe they're an expert on AI/ML and they'll ask really good questions. So having those kinds of conversations has been super useful. And that's what I'm hoping we'll continue to see from the agency.
Third case study, and then we'll get to some of the ones that have been sent in. Thank you for all of you who've been sending us some pretty interesting questions. All right, so the third one is related to a major public health emergency. It's a burden of 100% on the patient population. I have a SAMD device on the market that predicts onsets of a tragic disease called moody teenagerism. It impacts 100% of teenagers and parents. We got a PCCP authorizing us to release updates to the device with a letter to file whenever a new social media platform comes out that we need to start tracking. Because teenagers are unpredictable and unstable, the FDA put some very stringent post-market monitoring requirements on the PCCP. I have a submission coming up for a new version of this device. I'm hoping I can get the FDA to relax on their post-market PCCP requirements because we've been doing really well so far. Do you have any suggestions on if or how there might be more wiggle room for us now? Please help me. The sanity of hundreds of millions of parents depends on your advice.
So I think that this question of wiggle room, right, can be reframed in a way that is not dependent on FDA world now versus FDA world 6 months ago, right? It's just a basic truth, which is to say this. I have never seen or heard of FDA resisting the idea of a more efficient way to evaluate products and assure their safe and effective performance post-market in a way that accounts for the product's unique technology, right? And so if you take a look, and let me just give you a little more of a concrete example. If you take a look at FDA's approach to digital technology, right? PCCP And FDA's approach to design controls for digital technologies has regularly reflected the fact that these device types are different, right? Not digital technology is different than traditional brick and mortar technology, and expecting them to follow the same design control processes and the need to lock design or come in and get agency approval for changes before changes are implemented, that's totally that's just unrealistic, right? And so what the agency, I think, to its credit, has done is to say, like, yeah, we get it. Like, let's get smart people together around a table to figure out what the balance point is between different ways that the agency can assure that core regulatory requirements are met, and ways that companies can operate to meet the nature of their technology. So the question is not like the agency is never going to have a conversation about whether or not there needs to be sufficient evidence of safety and effectiveness. That's bedrock, right? But definitely the agency is going to have conversations about whether there are alternative methodologies to demonstrate safety and effectiveness, like the provision of information post-market after a device has come to market. So Randy, your face is showing up on my screen, and I am terribly concerned that I've managed to confuse you and others listening. So just tell me if I'm off the reservation.
I'll let the other experts handle that one.
No, I completely agree. I think it comes back to what's your defensible position? Like, what's your position? Come back to the FDA with, here's why we think this approach is founded in good engineering practices, it's founded in good science. It makes a lot of sense. It's going to bring, ensure safety and efficacy in a more efficient way. Think about that argument and bring that back to the FDA and look for those opportunities. It's worth having the conversation. And I've also experienced the FDA to be very open to those conversations.
And I would double down on that. One of the first things I experienced when I left FDA and I was on the industry side of the fence, talking to some of my peers, my colleagues, was there was a reluctance to go to FDA with well thought out arguments that maybe they hadn't seen precedent for. They thought, hey, this might be a reach, or there's no clear pathway for exactly what we're talking about, but we think this makes logical sense. We think it's in the best interest of public health. And we think we can string a thread together as to why this makes sense, not just for the business, but also from FDA's perspective. Here are their underlying concerns. Here's why we think we will continue to address those concerns, or those concerns may have already been addressed over the last X number of years of this product sort of being out there. So to me, I've always had more comfort of going in and saying, hey, I've got an idea. Let me walk you through this idea of why these controls that you placed on us previously may no longer apply or may no longer be necessary to address that underlying concern you raised. Oftentimes, that's also framed with an acknowledgement that concern was legitimate. That concern may have existed at a point in time that may no longer exist right now. But it's working with the agency to say, hey, we both have a shared goal of addressing these issues. My perspective is either the issues have already been addressed, or there are other mechanisms that are in place today to address those concerns. And maybe what we identified 6 months ago, 6 years ago, no longer applies today. And let's have a conversation and dialogue around that. I also recommend coming in with a proposal and a solution. It's much easier for FDA to say, yes, we agree with your proposal, than it is for them to say, we'll come back to you. I mean, they will not come back to you and say, we'll come up with a proposal. But if you say explicitly, here's what we would like to do, here's why we think it meets your existing needs, and here's our plan of how we would execute it, are you aligned? It is very easy, if they are aligned and if they agree, to say, yes, we think that makes sense, go forward, as opposed to this nebulous conversation. Let's have a great conversation about it, but if you didn't have a concrete proposal, there's nothing there for them to agree to.
And in that development of that argument, it may be helpful to look at your management team and your advisors and map that against the problem and see if you have the right team to propose a technical counter proposal versus a clinical counter proposal. And it all obviously depends on the nature of the change. Is it purely technical or mainly technical or clinical? And then you can beef up your organization with the right experts depending on the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that Kwame raises a really excellent point, which is that this is a multifaceted issue, and one critical aspect is who's making the argument to FDA. Do they fully understand the issues, and are they credible? That is a reflection of who's going to be listening to the arguments being made by the firm. And what I hear Kwame saying, and I agree completely, is who do you have on your bench who can have that conversation substantively and credibly?
Excellent.
Absolutely.
We are at 51 minutes after the hour. So for those who have to drop at the top of the hour, thank you for joining us. A quick reminder, we want your brutally candid feedback. Please send it in or take our call when we call to get it. If any of you need help developing medical device software or accelerating SAMD development, give us a call. If any of you need regulatory consulting advice, feel free to call Steve, Kwame, or Phil as well. And I want to thank our panelists now before they get off for joining us on this. Okay, some other questions we have. I'm going to take a couple of small ones first that are interesting. One person said, if I see an opportunity to pick up as staff FDA employees, what's the best way to get good people from the FDA in my company right now?
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit of activity there. That would probably be my, unless you have a direct connection, maybe you have someone in your network, that would be my approach.
Yeah, I'll say there's two other things to keep in mind. So when I was leaving the FDA, there are ethical prohibitions on how you engage with the regulated company, different ethical disclosures you can make internally when you are ready to apply to different things. It can be challenging for an FDA, I'll just use the generic term FDA reviewer, for an FDA reviewer to have a transparent conversation with industry that, hey, I'm thinking about leaving. What would my opportunities sort of look like in an organization like yourselves? What's helpful is if you think there's a need, if you create a very specific position description, hey, you're very much targeting an FDA, not an individual reviewer, but somebody with this experience. FDA reviewers, in my experience, are much more comfortable applying to a job with a clear description that matches up to what they have expertise in than having those informal networking conversations that maybe those of us in industry are more accustomed to having. It doesn't mean they can't have them and they can't have them within the right ethical parameters, but it can be challenging to find themselves there. So two things I would do is, number one, create positions and maybe craft that description very specific so you know that it is really being targeted at somebody with direct and maybe a very recent FDA experience. The second piece will be look at the people that you've been working with. And I'm not suggesting that you're trying to hire former or current FDA reviewers that are currently working on your files and maybe dangling something out there would change the way that interaction goes. But I've noticed, I've had a lot of conversations recently, a lot of FDA reviewers are switching their profile to be that open to work piece. Look at their LinkedIn profile, look what's happening there. Then once you've identified somebody's looking to maybe make that transition, there are other ways that you can sort of engage in those conversations ethically. Think through, maybe if you have HR departments, think about that. But I would say LinkedIn is a good way to identify who might be in the market, but creating actual position descriptions that people can apply to is a great way to start that conversation.
I feel like I feel compelled to share that in my view, there are a few profiles of former FDA reviewers, and by the way the question was phrased, I just want to share a few things. Picking up talent. There are reviewers who have 20 plus years of FDA experience. They're not reviewers probably anymore. And they want to be the sage old internal advisor in a company or consulting firm and maybe never even want to interact with the FDA. There are maybe more junior people who want to take what they learned at the FDA over 2 to 5 years and be a part of a team that takes products from concept to commercialization. Some people want to work internal to a law firm. There are all flavors of talent at the FDA with all types of motivations. And that's a nuance that I don't think people readily pick up.
All right, thank you. One other quick question, then we'll get to some of the bigger ones people have thrown in. I think Megan, you made a case for engaging with the FDA, not just directly as your company, but also getting engaged in larger industry groups that can help move the needle, have communication. So maybe if you all could enlighten us on a couple of the organizations specifically, either individual membership or corporate membership that are out there that people might want to get engaged in.
Sure. Where I see quite a bit on the standard side of the world, organizations like Amy, CTA is doing standards, particularly in the AIML space. Those are a couple of the ones that are relatively straightforward to join and participate in. ISO tends to be more on the side of bigger companies, but those are some areas. There's also reps for regulatory professionals. There's a huge opportunity there. You can even do things like webinars or, participate in educational events or something like that. So those are some areas where that knowledge base, like Kwame, talked about, like there's a variety of different skills and roles and perspectives that can be brought to those.
Very briefly, Randy, with the disclosure that I worked at AdvaMed for several years, I'll say you cannot consider industry engagement with respect to these topics without taking a close look at AdvaMed, ADVAMED. It is the predominant medical device trade association. It has initiatives that touch on all the issues that we have covered during our call, as well as others. And it includes an organization called AdvaMed Excel, ACCEL, which is specifically targeted to startups and smaller firms, recognizing that they are different entities. And so it is, again, table stakes. You have to look at AdvaMed if you're going to engage on these issues.
Okay, so call AdvaMed and tell them that Steve sent you. AdvaMed/Steve.
If I get 10 memberships, I get a mug.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so we've got a couple of related questions I'm going to try and bundle together, which is in the AIML space, we've gone from looking at sort of standalone AIML models that are very discrete and on their own into more of this open world of foundational models and third-party agents and these more sprawling interdependent kind of things that seem to be sort of a next generation challenge for medical devices. A lot of potential, also no risk to manage. Some of that we've seen certainly with large language models, but not exclusively. There are companies that are selling foundational models or building them to work across multiple AIML. If you're working on devices in that space right now, should you making any changes in your thinking, your approach, your planning, your pre-subs?
I think the answer is being open to potential changes is where we need to be from a mind space perspective. We have not seen any new policies coming out of the agency. We have not seen any stakes in the ground as to where we're going to be in the future. But I think it would be naive to not anticipate that there's going to be some changes in thinking. Quite honestly, that might be a greater focus on deregulatory state, maybe less oversight coming directly from the agency. I'm thinking about some of the things that we've heard coming out of different parts of the administration in terms of the need for growth in this space. You've got other parts that are also recognizing the inherent risks associated with some of those as well. So I don't know where we're going to be 6 months from now, but I would anticipate there's going to be working groups, there's going to be new thinking and new leadership comments coming out around these types of products. The challenge is right now, if you're launching a product today, what do you do with that information? And my answer right now would be you stay with the information you've received thus far. If something changes in the future, you have to be prepared to adapt. But in the absence of information, I would not suggest a company pause and say, we're just not going to make any progress until we hear more. I think you operate with what you know, knowing that you may need to reevaluate as new information comes to light.
About a year ago, maybe it was more than a year, Orthogonal hosted Bakul Patel. And I remember he said something so simple that companies, in essence, should focus on clearly describing their software. And fast forward now, I still think that holds true. The basic fundamental activity of having a clear software architecture, description of key features, claims of all these AI ML models, and a clear user journey can answer a lot of these issues and get you prepared. It seems very simple, but I would say there inevitably is a lack of clarity on the FDA side for complex systems like what you're describing. So if you can nail that, that's a win.
I think that's a fantastic point and suggestion. And that's really, I have also seen that, like, it, the traditional way of thinking about your device is to do the regulatory, device analysis and then see what applies. Software doesn't quite work that way. You really do have to build your software with really sound software engineering practices. You need to have a clear description. You need to know what it's going to do. You need to have that user story. You need to know, how it's going to be used, and you need to have a clear architecture. I don't think that most software companies, this is necessarily where the strength is. And so just as a, a generalization, if you will, if you'll, allow that, I don't see a lot of, excellence in these areas. That's a huge opportunity for industry and bringing, it is very simple, but it's really interesting when you start having those conversations, how hard it can be to say, well, what does it really do? And put it in terms of how the software is, what are the major pieces of it? Simply, not, what are the major modules? What are the major functions? And then how does it interact with the rest of the system? How is it used throughout the life cycle? How do you maintain it? Those kinds of things, having that absolute clarity is going to help everything else. It's not just going to help you with your development and to make that efficient so that you know, you're kind of nailing the quality from the design point of view, but also it's going to make it really a lot easier to explain and translate what the software does to that regulatory framework. Whatever it ends up, regulatory frameworks change. That's part of the nature of them. They evolve over time. Uh, you don't have to constantly adapt your product to that framework. You just start with software engineering practices. I think that helps quite a bit.
Thank you. And by the way, to people submitting some of these questions, some of you have submitted some really terrific, more elaborate technical questions. We'd be happy to take those offline, but I think some of them may be a little deep to go into here, even though they're terrific. Okay, someone asked in the converse side, if I'm getting ready for a 510K submission, should I be sprinting to get it in before the end of this fiscal year?
I think my focus would be on putting together the most complete and robust submission you possibly can, and cutting corners to get it in before October 1st of this year, which is when the fiscal year ends, I think is probably doing a disservice to the substantive work that needs to be done by the team. If the question is around, are we worried about sort of the resources being depleted? I don't think it's going to be like an October 1st sort of cutoff. I think what you're probably going to see is hiring freezes, followed by maybe more targeted sort of cuts in different areas. But I don't think there's going to be a magic date where the organization goes from everything's running smoothly or close to smoothly to the gears grind to a halt. So to me, my focus would be on getting a robust and complete submission ready to go. And I always recommend, if the testing's done and we've got everything ready to go, let's submit. I'd rather have the clock running and let FDA come back to us with questions than we polish it 10 different times before it goes in there. But the fundamental assumption is we've got a strong, robust, and well thought out regulatory strategy and regulatory submission, and getting that in by a certain date is of lesser of a concern for me based on what I know right now.
All right. So the bottom line from all of you is nobody needs to go crazy. We just need to keep doing the good job we're doing and keep our nose to the grindstone in the interim. Be informed.
And be situationally aware.
Yeah. And running the risk of being a little doomsday, I do believe, as Phil described it, there was this, let's just call it 10% cut that is still being worked out, but then there's a deeper cut. And candidly, if that deeper cut happens, that could have knock-on effects for the next 1 to 5 years. So I would just be mentally prepared for this kind of a shallow cut, and then there's a deeper cut. And the implications of that is what we spent the last hour talking about, and hold on to your chair for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to Kwame's point, it's worth making explicit, right? Virtually all federal agencies, certainly FDA, have been compelled to submit reduction in force plans to the administration for consideration and implementation. It's a two-phase process. The first phase was completed in March of this year, earlier this month, although very little information about what types of cuts or the volume of cuts is being circulated. Step two will take place in April, mid-April, right? But the expectation is that all of these cuts will be accomplished by September of this year, right? So more pain is coming down the road. There's a very high potential for it to be disruptive. The specific contours of that pain haven't been clarified at this time.
Someone on the opportunity side, should I be smiling if my device is related to chronic disease management?
I think clearly there's been signals from the new Secretary of Health and Human Services in that area. And there, I believe, will be a drive for efficiency, which is not new to the agency, operationally, to even further improve the time targets that are already a part of user fees. So I think what is relatively easy and what probably will be executed against is speed and time. Even in view of these pretty significant cuts that we expect, there will be a lot. I think there will be pressure on the FDA for speed of review.
Another couple interesting questions I'll fuse together, which kind of open with the story that, 15 years ago, there was a Stanford biodesign study where they interviewed a ton of CEOs and said, where would you rather bring a cool device to market? And the answer was overwhelmingly Europe. It's a pain to work in the US. Fast forward, Jeff Shuren came in, a lot of changes, establishment of MDIC, all kinds of other things. Kwame was co-author of a study maybe 2 years ago that essentially looked at these questions again 15 years later and found out that actually the tables had flipped. I should note, really, that's an amazing thing to say that a government agency reinvented itself in the eyes of the people it's regulating, and not just because they laid down and said, do whatever you want. So two related questions. One is it prudent to be taking a second look at Europe if you're trying to do something innovative and new right now? Not necessarily should you change strategies, but should we be taking a second look at Europe as a better place if they've got their backlog cleared and can process an MDR first review in under 3 months? And the second one is essentially, I think what they're asking is, should we be threatening to go to Europe to create a fear of missing out to make sure that things don't happen at the FDA we don't want, that they aren't hurt?
I'll take the first question. I don't know about the threatening, but when you're thinking about your strategy, first and foremost, you need to think about your business and where does it make sense to have your product? Do you have local support for especially, and I'm thinking primarily for new products coming to the market. Do you have local support? Are there physicians, patient organizations, something like that who are going to support it? Are you clear about how you're going to get paid? How you're going to sell it? Is it a reimbursement model? Is it a, private pay? However you, whatever the economics of it are. I still think that the FDA has a more straightforward submission timeline. It's still considered, like we talked about earlier, kind of a key market from a business strategy perspective and business valuation perspective. So I don't know that I would stop looking at US just because of these changes. I think it goes back to regulatory requirements evolve over time. The more your strategy is resilient to some of these changes, that you're looking ahead, that you're not panicking, that you're not, changing with, every little change, that you're really thinking about what are you trying to achieve? How are you going to achieve it? Even the question about should we wait, does it make sense for you to wait? For your business for some reason, if you have a robust regulatory strategy, go forward, right? If a submission, go forward with it. And if you don't, work on getting that as soon as possible. So, things don't usually improve just by waiting. Because what you know right now, no one knows what's going to be true in 6 months or 3 months or 1 month. So all of this is speculation. So I think that having that business first mentality and then really thinking about still considering US a very high value market and a very straightforward, you don't need a 1345 cert before you go to the US, right? So you can be compliant in your quality management system and you can go forward. You can look at both markets at the same time, or other markets that you might want to consider. That'd be my perspective.
A quick story and for the complaining question. So Scott Whitaker, the CEO of AdvaMed, when the initial 10% cut was announced, leapt into action and collaboratively wrote a public letter, but in my opinion, collaborated effectively to be a voice that resulted within about a week of the rehiring of 202 of that 219. And so my point is, the way you punch up as a small or even large organization is having some level of activity with a major trade association like AdvaMed, who can speak as the voice of the industry. There's another organization called MDMA who has a very strong voice as well. But that's how I would spend my time if I wanted to, air quotes, complain.
I would flag, so I think the trade associations are a really valuable tool. There are some organizations that also have the power to speak individually, and this is generally it's a scale issue, right? If you are, I don't want to throw any specific company under the bus, but or not under the bus, but to highlight them. If you are ABC Mega Corporation, you've got 200,000 employees worldwide with a global footprint and selling $100 billion of product annually, you have the ability to have conversation and explain the consequence, the patient access issues to FDA, to the administration, to your representatives in a way that a small company, a startup company, just doesn't. So I do think there are direct advocacy issues that could be raised for some companies as well, but you've got to recognize, where are you individually, your organization, going to have the strongest voice, make the biggest impact? And I think that's why we're hearing a lot of recognition for the trade associations. There are other groups out there that don't necessarily represent industry, but also could be aligned. You generally think about industry and patient advocacy groups aren't always singing from the same songbook, but I think they generally share a similar message and similar goal, which is, how do we make sure that we're getting new, safe, and effective products to market and to patients as quickly as possible? When you think about opportunities in the rare disease space, breakthrough designation devices, there's a tremendous opportunity there where I could say, sort of hearing from a trade association or a company that's financially interested in getting their product to market might fall on deaf ears. But hearing from a patient group that says, hey, we see tremendous value in treating a disease that is debilitating or going untreated today, that can have a strong voice as well.
Democracy in action. Two interesting questions. I'll kind of group them here. This is fun. Which is, if you want to zoom out a little bit, most of our conversation right now has talked about sort of CDRH and medical devices in Ireland. Let's zoom out at two levels, and I'll put them together at once so you can address. One is, what about if you've got devices designed to work with drugs? drug delivery devices, companion apps, those kinds of things. Because clearly there's a lot of change headed towards the pharmaceutical side of the FDA. So take what you've said so far. Does your opinion shift if it's now, something that's paired with a drug in some way? And then the second one says zoom out even further and say, the whole enchilada of federal policy is not just regulation, it's also reimbursement and changes at CMS and alignment between the efforts to align FDA and CMS things to make it easier for device companies. So changes at those two levels. It's a broad questions.
I want to take the first part because it's it's easy and doesn't make me have to pretend to know about stuff at CMS, which I don't. Look, a lot of the principles that we have discussed today have been raised in the context of devices and in the context of life inside CDRH. And I think that a lot of the principles apply equally to other parts of FDA, including parts that are brought in because of, for example, combination products. So a combination product is a product like a stent that might have a drug component and a device component. There's a whole regulatory framework for figuring out how those products are handled, but for purposes of today's discussion, what you need to know, I think, is that both CDRH, the device center, and CDER, the drug center, are at the table, right? Well, with respect to those kinds of issues, right, there is a lot of commonality in the points that we have discussed today. There are still, whether you're talking about the drug center or the device center, there are still stakeholders that are trying to determine whether or not their historical experience as they, for example, go through the product review process will be a predictor of what they can expect in the coming 6 months or a year, or whether there are changes that they need to begin to plan for. I will say I have not seen anything that suggests that the playbook is different for drugs as opposed to devices as opposed to biologics, which is to say, it is a somewhat chaotic environment for all medical products, all FDA regulated products, and every part of the agency maintains its commitment to core functions in the same way that it did a year ago and ought to be engaged, in my opinion, with the expectation that until otherwise notified or problems emerge, they're more than competent of handling core responsibilities. So I think that those are basic principles. Whether or not there are fact scenarios that arise that require a little bit of refinement of that basic operating style, yeah, I'm sure that there are, but I don't want to list a bunch of hypotheticals that may or may not be relevant to your listeners.
So Steve, I agree with everything you said. I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here for a second, because there's one data point that strikes me as I can't really explain it. A month ago, when all the probationary employees from CDRH were let go on a Saturday evening, CDER and CBER were not touched in the same way.
Right.
And I come back and I think through what could be a justification for that? Could it simply have been the tackling it center by center? And I recognize that I think tobacco products and CIFSAN, or what used to be CIFSAN, were in that same lump. So one explanation could simply be they didn't get to those other centers. Another explanation could be possibly the public views. When I ask my grandparents, what does FDA do? They don't know exactly what I do. They know I'm a lawyer, but they don't understand all the nuance and the details that FDA has oversight for. They probably think of, they approve drugs, they approve vaccines, and that's probably it. They don't understand all the other nuance. So there might be some dynamic of the budgetary impacts, the resource impacts that are happening, I believe, likely across FDA. They could be different center by center. I will emphasize again, this is a devil's advocate position. I actually don't believe this is where we're going to end up, but it's at least possible that the way that the new administration, the way that the appropriated dollars roll out, might not be uniformly applied to a device center, to a biologic center, and to a drug center. I think we're yet to see how that'll play out, but as we're talking about the distinctions between a device, a combination product, and a drug, we should at least be aware that that is something that might change.
I think that's a fair point, Phil. I mean, look, I would say this. It is critically important to be aware of what is going on politically as context to try to evaluate events at FDA. And you're right. The Drug Center and the Biologics Center were not affected by probationary staff cuts in the same way that the Device Center was. And Smart Money says it's because of sensitivity coming out of the pandemic to having a robust drug and biologic safeguard system, right? Okay, yes, correct. Now, turning back to FDA for a moment, what does that mean for the FDA's operations today? On the one hand, the drug and the biologics center may be a little bit more insulated from upheaval as compared to other parts of the agency. On the other hand, I don't think that those parts of the agency are reshifting the way that they do business compared to how they did it a year ago in a way that stakeholders really need to be accounting for. And if you have a different view, we should definitely talk about that.
You're on mute, Randy. You're on mute, Randy.
I blame China.
There we go. Sorry about that. I missed the button. Does anyone want to take a 90-second stab at the CMS side of this question?
So
bring it up
oh, go ahead.
ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Kwame, you go.
Real quick, I think the organizations that are closest to any changes in CMS reverting to MCET, which was guaranteed reimbursement for breakthrough devices, as an example, would be AdvaMed and MDMA. And I think there's more pressure to reduce government spending. So a reversion to MCET, as I think through it, and I'm not a I'm not a former staffer, it's less. That's 45 seconds.
Kwame hit the exact same topic I was going to go to. And I think the flip side of what Kwame just said is if you just look at FDA cuts, if breakthrough designation and resources focused on granting breakthrough designation requests were to disappear, there's currently pretty significant reimbursement benefits to being in that breakthrough category. And FDA sort of pulls the rug out from underneath that program. It does jeopardize a lot of companies and organizations that might have bet their go-to-market strategy or their reimbursement strategy on obtaining clearance or approval under that program. So a lot of question marks, a lot of unknowns, but I think that's the one area that I've got my eye on with regards to CMS and reimbursement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Randy, you're muted again.
Thank you to many people who have hung out here. We still have a really nice crowd here. Before we have to start dropping off, I would like to ask each of the panelists to give a couple of action items. If you're advising a medical device company, things you should do right now leaving this meeting based on today's conversation. Top action items or assignments.
I'll go first. So my number one recommendation is don't panic. Think about building resiliency into your regulatory strategy, stay situationally aware, make sure you know what the current requirements are, stay on top of what's going on, and really make sure that you have a robust strategy that is resilient to the changing nature of regulatory landscape. The other one is I'm always going to be an advocate for building that quality into your framework. So if your product has strong software engineering built into it, that's going to help to have that resiliency as well. It's going to build the quality in. The better the quality on the market, the less regulatory burden you're going to have. So that's always something I'm going to advocate for. And then also in this time, reach out to your FDA contacts in the ways that we talked about here that are ethical and appropriate, because there's some great talent there, and always looking for opportunity when things change like this, to maybe, get some new people in your network, or maybe you can do a referral, maybe bring them into your organization. So
I'm going to make mine real concise, and I'll double down on what Megan said. Don't panic. And what I advise all my clients early on in my engagement, regardless of when I come on board, is like, can we crystallize our regulatory strategy down to a single one-pager? And oftentimes it takes people out of the weeds, gets us back to high level. What is our overall strategy? If you have that one-page document that lays out your regulatory strategy, every time something changes in the news cycle, a new guidance document comes out from FDA, a new executive order from the administration, I like to go back to that high-level document. What we're hearing now, does that fundamentally change our big picture regulatory strategy? The answer is generally not, probably not. Oftentimes it may change a direct interaction, a way that we approach an issue, a way that we approach collecting different pieces of data, but fundamentally it doesn't change the way that we're bringing this product to market. And I like to remind my clients that yes, the landscape is changing constantly. That is a given. It will continue to change, but it should not and often does not change the core principles of what FDA is going to expect to see from us and how we're going to demonstrate the appropriate regulatory standard.
I would institute on a cadence that makes sense for your business, a responsible person that reports out on regulatory risks and how you're going to manage them. We do this with clients on a monthly basis, sometimes even more frequent than that. And we have a very simple framework, low, medium, high regulatory risk. And this is how we're going to manage it. And I think that's a systemic change that everyone should have in place.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists here. Steve, you have a wonderful practice. You make predictions at the beginning of each year for your readers. And then at the end of the year, you hold yourself accountable by evaluating whether or not your predictions came true. I propose we reconvene in 1 year and see how good our advice was. In the meantime, I think it was absolutely world-class. You couldn't think of a better group of people to assemble for this. And with that, we are going to play the full theme song for our show here. For those who want to hang out, if you wait for the second verse, there's actually some good stuff in there.
There will be waiting.
Randy, if you could circulate this MP3 file, we would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I will absolutely do that. Can you hear?
Yes.
Got a question? Call us now. We've got Randy, Megan's on the prowl. Steve and Phil with Kwame too. They've got the answers just for you. FDA changes in the air. Software rules will help you there. Connected devices, AI too. We'll break it down just for you.
We're all going to sing along the second time the chorus comes through, okay?
With technology problems.
Dial it in. Don't be shy. We'll clear the clouds. No need to cry. Medical devices. What's the drill? We've got the team with all the skill. FDA changes in the air. Software rules will help you there. Connected devices, AI too. We'll break it down just for you.
Randy, you had me at FDA.
Dial it in.
Live the
Taylor
full life.
Swift better watch out.
Clear the clouds. No need to cry. Medical devices. What's the drill? We've got the team with all the skill. FDA changes in the air. Software rules will help you there. Connected devices, AI too. We'll break it down just for you. Randy, Megan, answers clear. Steve and Kwame, Phil is here. Call us up, don't delay. answered the FDA way.
We're gonna start a band
There
after
we go.
on tour.
Someone did ask if this was an AI composed song, and the answer is thankfully yes.
So
All right. Well, Randy, thank you for hosting us today, and especially thank you for that wonderful song you've produced for us.
totally
Thank you all. We're gonna turn the webinar output into a song also. So,
amazing.
Perfect.
Thank you all.
there you go.
Bye, everybody.